The solitude of the Wyoming high country was a balm Eli Walker applied to wounds he could not name. It was 1874, and the war was nearly a decade gone. But its ghosts still walked with him in the thin, cold air. His cabin, a squat structure of hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, stood a stone's throw from the Wind River, its back pressed against a stand of unyielding pines. He had built it himself, built it to be a fortress against memory, against the world of men that had failed him. He was a tall man, made lean by hard work and lean living. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was a map of past hardships, with lines etched around eyes the color of a stormy sky. His hands were calloused and capable, as comfortable with an axe as they had once been with a rifle. He was an ex-sergeant of the Union Army, a man who had seen the fields of Gettysburg turn to red mud. And now he worked as a ranch hand for a cattleman whose spread was a half-day's ride away. He took his pay in supplies and the right to be left alone, a bargain that suited both parties. Town was a place he avoided. Lander was a raw, burgeoning settlement filled with noise and judgment. The folks there looked at him and saw a man who had fought for the North, a Yankee presence in a territory where sympathies had often been divided. They saw a man who did not speak of his past, who did not drink in their saloons or pray in their churches, and they mistrusted his silence. For his part, Eli saw in their faces the same blind certainty that had sent boys, his own brother among them, into the meat grinder of war. The quiet resentment from the locals was a dull ache, but the thunder of cannon that still echoed in his quietest moments was a sharp, unhealing pain. So he kept to his cabin, to the company of the river and the unsparing mountains. That spring had been a bitter one. Clinging to winter with a stubborn fist, a late snow in May had blanketed the high peaks. And now, under the relentless sun of early June, it was letting go. The melt came fast and furious. The Wind River, usually a clear, quick-running ribbon of blue, had transformed into a churning brown beast. It chewed at its banks, dragging dirt and debris into its maw, its roar a constant, menacing presence that filled Eli's small valley. The log bridge downstream was likely washed out, which meant his planned ride for supplies would require fording the river at the shallows miles upstream. A dangerous proposition. He was checking his horse's shoes near the corral, the rhythmic rasp of the file a familiar comfort. When he heard it, it was a sound that did not belong to the wilderness. Not the cry of a hawk or the scream of a catamount. It was human, a thin, desperate shriek, swallowed almost immediately by the river's growl. Eli froze, head cocked, listening. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it, another phantom from a past filled with cries. Then it came again, fainter this time but unmistakable, a woman's voice, sharp with terror. His body moved before his mind had fully consented. He dropped the file and ran toward the riverbank, his long legs eating up the ground. He scanned the torrent, his eyes sweeping across the roiling surface, snagging on the chaos of broken branches and uprooted saplings caught in the current. And then he saw her, a flash of dark fabric and pale skin, tangled in the branches of a fallen cottonwood that was being battered by the main force of the water. She was caught, a fragile anchor in a world of violent motion. He did not hesitate. There was no time for thought. Only the cold, hard instinct of a man who had pulled comrades from fields of fire. He kicked off his heavy boots, stripped off his gun belt, and plunged into the icy water. The shock of the cold was a physical blow. It stole his breath and drove 1,000 needles into his skin. The current was a living thing, a powerful muscle that grabbed at his legs, trying to pull him under. He fought it, his arms churning, his eyes locked on the woman. He was a strong swimmer, but this was not swimming. It was a brawl. Debris scraped against him, a heavy log bumping his shoulder with bruising force. He grunted, spat out a mouthful of gritty water, and pushed on. As he got closer, he could see her more clearly. Her head was barely above the surface, her face a pale oval against her dark, plastered-down hair. One arm was hooked desperately around a thick branch, while the current tore at the rest of her body, threatening to rip her away. She appeared to be caught on something beneath the water as well. Her eyes were closed, her face slack with near unconsciousness. He reached the cottonwood, gasping for air, his muscles screaming from the cold and exertion. "Hold on!" he yelled, his voice raw. He grabbed a sturdy limb, anchoring himself against the pull of the river. He had to work quickly. The entire tree was groaning, threatening to break free and be swept downstream. He reached for her, his fingers closing around her thin, cold arm. She did not respond. Her dress, a simple calico, was torn at the shoulder, and a dark bruise was already purpling on her cheek. A sodden leather satchel was still tethered to her wrist by its strap. A strange, desperate attachment in the face of death. He saw that her leg was wedged between two branches below the waterline. He took a deep breath, submerged himself in the frigid water, and worked blindly with his hands, fumbling with the slick wood. His lungs burned. Finally, with a great heave, he freed her limb. He resurfaced, dragging her with him. She was limp now, a dead weight. Using the last of his strength, he pulled her away from the snag and began the brutal fight back to shore. He half dragged, half carried her out of the water and collapsed on the muddy bank, his chest heaving. For a long moment, all he could do was lie there, the roar of the river filling his ears, the woman, a cold, still presence beside him. He rolled onto his side and pressed his fingers to her neck. He felt a pulse, faint and thready, but there. She coughed, a racking, painful sound, and a stream of river water trickled from her mouth. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of moss, cloudy with confusion and pain. They fixed on him, wide with a primal fear. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough. "You're safe." She struggled to sit up, her body trembling violently. Her dress was in tatters, clinging to her in a way that left little to the imagination. She seemed to realize it at the same time he did, and her arms flew to cover her chest. Where am I?" she whispered, her teeth chattering. "My land, near the Wind River." He rose to his feet, his own clothes dripping, a chill seeping deep into his bones. "You need to get warm. My cabin is close." He reached a hand down to help her. She flinched away from his touch, scrambling backward in the mud like a startled deer. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Do not take me to town, please." Her plea was so raw, so filled with a dread that seemed to eclipse even her near drowning, that it stopped him cold. He looked from her terrified face toward the distant trail that led to Lander. He had no desire to go to town, but she did not know that. "I am not taking you to town," he said gruffly. "But you will die of cold out here. The cabin is your only choice." She watched him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face, weighing one danger against another. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, she relented. She tried to stand on her own, but her legs gave way. Without a word, Eli scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a bird-boned fragility that felt alien against his own solid frame. She went stiff at his touch but did not fight him. As he carried her toward the column of smoke rising from his chimney, he could feel the tremors that racked her body and the dead, heavy weight of the waterlogged satchel still dangling from her wrist. He pushed the cabin door open with his shoulder and carried her inside. The small, one-room space was spare and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within. A narrow cot stood against the far wall, a rough-sawn table and two chairs in the center, and shelves holding tins of food, a few books, and a neat stack of ammunition. It was the scent of the place, wood smoke, coffee, and solitude. That seemed to unnerve her most. She was an intrusion, and they both knew it. He set her down gently in the chair closest to the hearth. "Get those wet things off," he ordered, his back already turned as he added more wood to the fire. It was not a suggestion. It was a command born of practicality. He did not look at her, giving her what little privacy the small room allowed. He busied himself at the stove, putting a pot of coffee on to boil, the familiar actions a way to steady his own rattled nerves. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the sound of her chattering teeth. "I will not be a bother," she said finally, her voice still shaky. "As soon as my clothes are dry, I will be on my way." He grunted in response, not turning around. Her defensiveness was like a shield, sharp and bristling. It pricked at his own carefully guarded solitude, and he felt a flash of irritation. He had not asked for this. He had not asked for a half-drowned woman with fear in her eyes to disrupt the quiet rhythm of his life. Yet, as he listened to the soft rustle of wet fabric being peeled from skin, a different feeling stirred in him, something akin to curiosity. Who was she, and what was she running from that was worse than a flooded river? He poured 2 cups of coffee, lacing them both with a healthy dose of whiskey from the bottle he kept for the cold, and set one on the floor beside her chair before retreating to the far side of the room. He finally allowed himself to look at her. She was huddled in his spare blanket, her wet dress and underthings draped over the other chair, steaming in the fire's heat. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, and the bruise on her cheek stood out starkly against her pale skin. She held the coffee cup in both hands, trying to absorb its warmth, but her gaze was fixed on the flames, her expression distant and haunted. "My name is Eli Walker," he said, breaking the silence. It felt strange to say his own name aloud in this cabin. She looked up, her mossy green eyes meeting his for the first time without immediate fear. "Clara Jensen," she whispered. They sat that way for a long time, sipping the hot, bitter coffee. The whiskey worked its way through him, dulling the chill in his bones and the sharp edges of his thoughts. He watched her, and he saw the way her hand would occasionally tighten on the blanket, the way she flinched when a log popped in the fire. She was a woman wound tight with secrets. "You ought to eat something," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She shook her head. "I am fine." "You are not fine," he countered flatly. "You were nearly swept to kingdom come." Her chin lifted a fraction. "I am grateful for your help, Mr. Walker, but I do not require anything more. I will be gone by morning." "The river will not be down by morning," he said, "or the day after. You are stuck here." The reality of his words seemed to land on her like a physical weight. Her shoulders slumped, and the fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a profound weariness. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "My husband," she began, her voice cracking. "He passed recently." She took a shaky breath and stared into the fire as if the words were written there. He was a gambler. He left behind debts. Bad ones." She clutched the blanket tighter. "The men he owed, they came for the land, our homestead. They said it was theirs now." Eli remained silent, letting her speak. He knew the kind of men who collected debts in this part of the country. They did not operate with paperwork and lawyers. "I had to leave," she continued, her voice barely audible over the fire. "I packed what I could." Her gaze flickered to the wet satchel on the floor. "I rode all night. I did not know the river was so high. My horse, she panicked midstream. She threw me." A fresh wave of shudders went through her. "I thought—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not have to. So that was it, a widow, a debtor, a fugitive. It was a common enough story in the West, a land that promised new beginnings but often delivered harsher endings. He felt a reluctant stirring of pity, an emotion he had tried to cauterize long ago. Pity was dangerous. It led to connection, and connection led to pain. As dusk settled, bleeding purple and gray into the sky, the small cabin grew darker, the world shrinking to the circle of firelight. Eli lit a lantern, its steady glow pushing back the shadows. He prepared a simple meal of bacon and beans, and this time When he placed a plate before her, she ate, her movements slow and mechanical. When the time came to sleep, an awkward tension fell between them. There was only one cot. "You take the bed," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I will sleep by the fire." She nodded, her eyes downcast. "Thank you." He laid out his bedroll on the rough plank floor, keeping his back to her. He was acutely aware of her every movement, the soft rustle as she stood up, the quiet intake of breath. He stared into the dying embers of the fire, willing sleep to come. But his mind was alive, agitated by her presence. The cabin felt smaller, the air charged with a strange intimacy. He heard her move behind him, the soft pad of her bare feet on the floor. He thought she was getting into the cot. Instead, her voice came out of the darkness, a trembling whisper that was almost lost in the sigh of the wind outside. "Mr. Walker?" He did not move, did not turn. "What is it?" There was a long pause. He could hear the unsteady rhythm of her breathing. "Your shirt," she said. "The one from the war, is it clean?" He frowned into the darkness. He kept his old Union Army shirt folded in his trunk. It was worn thin at the elbows. The blue faded to a pale gray, but he kept it. He did not know why. "It is." Another silence stretched, taut and heavy. When she spoke again, her voice was so low he had to strain to hear it. It was stripped of all its earlier defenses, leaving only a raw, desperate vulnerability. "Do you want to look at me?" The question hit him like a stray bullet. It was so unexpected, so stark, that for a moment he could not process it. He remained frozen, his back to her, every muscle in his body tense. She took his silence for what it was not. "Will you stay if I undress?" she whispered. And in those words, he heard the echo of 100 transactions he could only imagine. He heard the shame, the resignation, the awful, hollow bartering of a woman with nothing left to sell but herself. She was offering him a payment for her rescue, for the food, for the shelter. A hot, unfamiliar shame washed over him. It mingled with a surge of anger. At her, at the men who had driven her to this, at a world that could break a person down to such a point. And beneath it all, a current of something else, a flicker of base desire he immediately crushed. He was a man, and she was a woman, and they were alone. But he was also a man who knew what it was to be broken. He turned his head just enough to see her silhouette in the firelight. She stood there, clutching the blanket, a fragile shape in the vast darkness. He could feel her trembling from across the room. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his body fully away from her, presenting her with nothing but his rigid back. He stared hard into the glowing coals of the fire, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Jensen," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "No one is going to bother you here." He did not hear her move for a long time. When she finally did, it was the quiet sound of the cot ropes creaking under her weight, followed by a soft, choked sob that she tried, and failed, to stifle in the darkness. Eli Walker lay on the hard floor, listening to the sound of her weeping and the unabated roar of the river, feeling the first crack spread across the frozen walls he had built around his heart. The night's raw confession hung in the air between them long after the fire had died to sullen embers. Sleep, for Eli, was a shallow, restless thing, punctuated by the woman's soft, ragged breathing from the cot. He was aware of her in a way that disturbed the deep-set quiet of his life. A stone dropped into a still pond. Her vulnerability was a kind of accusation, though he could not have said of what. When dawn broke, a sliver of bruised purple over the mountains. He was already up, the coffee pot simmering over a fresh fire. Clara did not rise until the sun was fully in the sky. She moved with a stiff, pained grace, a slight limp favoring her right leg, the one that had been caught in the branches. She did not meet his eyes. The shame of the previous night was a cloak she wore, her gratitude and her desperation having twisted into an offer that had been, however gently, refused. "The river is still too high," Eli stated, his voice flat as he stared out the open cabin door. It was not a conversation starter. It was a fact, as unchangeable as the granite peaks that loomed over them. The roar was a constant reminder of their confinement. "I see that," she replied quietly. She gathered her dress from the chair where it had dried, stiff and wrinkled. It was a poor thing, faded from the sun and now from the river, but she clutched it like armor. She disappeared for a moment behind a blanket he had hung for her, and when she returned, she was once again Clara Jensen, a woman fully dressed, if not fully composed. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. The swollen river made travel impossible, trapping them in a world no bigger than Eli's small plot of land. Clara, it turned out, was not a woman who could abide idleness. On the second morning, he found her in his small vegetable patch, painstakingly pulling the new weeds that had sprouted after the snowmelt. She moved slowly, her limp more pronounced after she knelt, but her hands were steady. "You do not have to do that," he said, standing over her, his shadow falling across the damp earth. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "It is better than sitting." Her gaze dropped back to the soil. "I am earning my keep." Eli did not argue. He understood the need to feel useful, the dignity in work. He left her to it and went about his own chores, chopping wood, repairing a section of fence the melt had damaged, checking on the few head of cattle he kept in the high pasture. Yet his awareness of her was a constant thrum beneath the surface of his thoughts. He would find himself watching her from a distance. He watched her limp to the creek to haul water, her thin arms straining with the weight of the buckets. He watched her knead dough on his rough-sawn table, a dusting of flour on her bruised cheek, her expression one of intense, solitary focus. She was a woman built of quiet resilience, but the damage was there to see if a man cared to look. One afternoon, as she reached up to hang a mended shirt of his on a line near the cabin, her dress shifted. Against the skin of her back, he saw them, faint, silvery lines, like faint lightning strikes against her flesh. Scars, old ones, but they were there. He looked away quickly, a muscle tightening in his jaw, a cold anger coiling in his gut. They were not the scars of an accident. She, in turn, seemed to study him in stolen glances. She avoided his eyes, yet he felt her gaze on him when he thought she was not looking. She was learning the contours of his silence, the way he held himself, the deep-seated weariness that clung to him like dust. They were two solitary animals circling one another in a cage forged by the floodwaters, wary and wounded. On the third day, he came into the cabin more quietly than usual and found her sitting at the table, her back to the door. Her shoulders were shaking with silent sobs. In her hands, she held a small, silver locket, its surface tarnished. He stopped in the doorway, unseen. He could not make out what was inside, but he saw the way she traced the rim with her thumb, a gesture of infinite tenderness and bottomless grief. He should have backed away, left her to her private sorrow, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. He made a sound, a deliberate scuff of his boot, and she startled, snapping the locket shut. She wiped furiously at her eyes with the back of her hand and turned, her face a mask of strained composure. "Mr. Walker." He did not acknowledge her tears. He walked to the stove, his movements stiff. "Something wrong?" he asked, his back to her. "No, it is nothing," she said, her voice tight. "Just a foolish memory." She slipped the locket back into the bodice of her dress, hiding it away. He heard her take a shaky breath. "He had his father's eyes," she whispered, so faintly he almost missed it. And then she said no more. She did not explain who he was, and Eli did not ask. He knew better than to pry at a wound that was still bleeding. But the image of her, weeping over the small, secret photograph of a child, settled in his mind and would not leave. The outside world intruded on the fourth day in the form of Jed, a younger ranch hand from the main spread who sometimes rode the perimeter. Eli saw him coming from a long way off, a lone rider against the vast landscape. He felt a familiar tightening in his gut, the instinct to retreat. Clara saw him too, and a flicker of panic crossed her face. "Who is that?" "Just a hand from the ranch," Eli said. "He will not bother you." Jed rode up to the corral, a lanky, talkative man with a sun-scorched face. "Walker, figured I'd check if the river carried you off to Nebraska," he called out, swinging down from his horse. His eyes widened slightly as he caught sight of Clara standing hesitantly in the cabin doorway. He swept his hat off his head. "Ma'am." "Jed," Eli said, his tone discouraging conversation. "What do you need?" Jed's gaze flickered between Eli and Clara, his curiosity palpable. "Boss wanted to know if you needed anything from town. I'm heading in, bridge is gone, but the crossing up at Flat Rock is passable if you are careful." He lowered his voice, but not enough. "Town's all abuzz. I tell you, about her." He nodded his head subtly toward Clara. Clara flinched as if struck and melted back into the shadows of the cabin, but the door remained ajar. Eli's eyes narrowed. "What about her?" "The widow Jensen," Jed said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper now. "Folks are saying all sorts of things. Say her husband, Silas, did not just die. Say he got himself killed in a brawl over cards at the saloon, owed money to some hard men, and they are saying," he leaned closer, "that she is a scandalous woman, that the land has been seized, and she ran off in the night." Eli's face was stone. "Folks should mind their own business." "Well, you know how it is," Jed said with a shrug. "Nothing to do but talk. Anyway, the marshal put a notice on the claim. It belongs to the creditors now. Seems she did not have a proper deed to it anyway." He finally seemed to notice the thunderous look on Eli's face and took a step back. "Well, I best be on my way. You need anything? Walker?" "No," Eli said, the words sharp as a shard of ice. Jed tipped his hat again vaguely toward the cabin. "Ma'am," he muttered, then mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a thick, poisoned silence in his wake. Eli stood for a long time, staring after the rider. The gossip was ugly, but it had the ring of truth to it, the kind of sordid tale that was all too common. He turned and went back inside. Clara was standing by the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale and pinched. She did not look at him. "He was right," she said, her voice a dead monotone. "What the man said, it is all true." Eli leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. He said nothing, just waited. "Silas did die in a fight," she confessed to the floorboards. "He was drunk, he always was, near the end, and the men he owed, they are not good men. They came to the house the morning after he was buried. They said I had 3 days to be gone." She finally looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears and a fierce, brittle pride. "What he said about the claim, that is true as well. We had no legal right to it. Not me, anyway." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Our marriage, it was not formal. We were married by a traveling preacher on the trail west, just before I found out I was with child. He never filed the papers. He always said he would, but he never did. So in the eyes of the law, I was never his wife. I was just the woman he lived with. I had no claim to anything." The shame in her voice was so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. He saw her then not as a widow, but as something far more vulnerable, a woman cast out, with no name, no protection, no rights that any man was bound to respect. The confession seemed to hang between them, a bridge of shared ruin, and Eli found himself walking across it. "Promises," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They are just words, easily broken." He pushed himself off the doorframe and walked to the small window, looking out at the unforgiving mountains. "I was 19 when I went to war," Left a younger brother back home, Samuel. He was 17, full of fire. Wanted to go with me. I told him no. I told him to stay, to look after our folks and my fiancée, Eleanor. I promised I would be back in a year. He paused, the memories thick in his throat. The war was not a year, it was 4. I saw things, did things, that a man should not have to see or do. I wrote letters home, but they stopped answering after a while. When it was finally over, I went back. Samuel had not listened. He had enlisted a year after me, died of dysentery in a camp in Virginia without ever seeing a real battle. He turned from the window, his stormy eyes meeting Clara's. And Eleanor, she had not waited. She had married a merchant from town a year before I returned, had a child with him. She told me she thought I was dead. Maybe she did, or maybe she just grew tired of waiting for a promise. He gave a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. I came back from the dead to find my brother in the ground and my future in another man's house. I never believed in another promise again. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty or awkward. It was filled with the weight of 2 broken pasts, 2 lives scarred by loss and betrayal. For the first time, Clara looked at him not as a savior or a threat, but as a man who understood the language of grief. That night, a chill wind swept down from the peaks, rattling the cabin. Clara seemed to have caught a chill of her own. She was quiet during their meager supper, and he noticed a feverish glint in her eyes. By the time they were ready to sleep, she was shivering uncontrollably, her skin hot to the touch. "You have a fever," he said, his voice laced with concern. "It is just a cold," she insisted, her teeth chattering as she pulled the blanket tighter around her on the cot. But it was not just a cold. As the night wore on, the fever climbed. She grew restless, tossing in the narrow bed, muttering things he could not understand. He spent the night by her side, a basin of cool river water and a rag in his hands. He bathed her forehead and her wrists, trying to bring the fever down. The fire was his only companion, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the deep, quiet hours before dawn, she grew still. He thought she was sleeping more peacefully. He reached out to feel her forehead, his calloused, rough hand gentle against her skin. Her eyes fluttered open. They were lucid for a moment, clear and deep. She looked at his hand on her forehead, and then up at his face, looming over her in the firelight. She did not seem afraid. Her own hand, small and hot, came up and clutched his, her grip surprisingly strong. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "You are the only one," she murmured, her voice thick and slurred with fever. "The only one who's touched me without wanting something." The words, spoken from the unguarded depths of her fevered mind, struck him with the force of a physical blow. He froze, his hand still on her brow, her fingers still wrapped around his. He had pulled her from the river. He had tended her bruises. He had bathed her forehead. Simple acts of necessity, of basic decency. But in her world, he realized with a sickening clarity, they were a profound anomaly. He saw again the faint, silver scars on her back, heard the echo of her whispered offer on that first night, a touch without a price. She slipped back into a restless sleep, but her words remained, burning behind his eyes. He could not sleep after that. He sat by the fire, watching over her, the weight of her quiet, devastating confession settling over him, changing everything. The fever broke with the dawn. He woke from a light doze to find the cabin filled with the pale, clean light of morning. Clara was still asleep, her breathing even, her skin cool to the touch. The worst had passed. He felt a profound sense of relief, an emotion so unfamiliar it startled him. He stood up, his joints stiff, and walked to the door. Needing air, the river's roar had subsided to a dull murmur. The flood was finally receding. She would be able to leave soon. The thought, which should have been a relief, left a strange, hollow ache in his chest. He walked down to the riverbank. The water was still high and brown, but the fury was gone. He stood there for a long time, watching the current, his mind turning over the events of the last few days. A soft sound behind him made him turn. It was Clara. She was standing a few feet away, barefoot in the damp grass. She was wearing his old, faded army shirt. It was far too big for her, swallowing her small frame. The sleeves rolled up to her elbows. It fell to her mid-thigh, her legs bare, her dark hair unbraided and loose around her shoulders. In the soft morning light, with the wildness of the landscape behind her, she looked like a wood sprite, a creature untethered from the harsh world that had so wounded her. She did not speak, just looked at him, her green eyes clear and searching. The defensive shield was gone. The fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, fragile plea. "The river is going down," he said, stating the obvious. She nodded. "I know." They stood in silence for another moment, the cool morning air between them. Then, she took a small step closer. "Eli?" she asked, using his first name for the first time. Her voice was quiet, almost carried away by the river's murmur. "Can I stay a little longer?" Her question, soft as the morning mist, hung between them on the riverbank. "Can I stay a little longer?" It was not a question about the river. Not really. It was a question about him. For a long moment, Eli did not answer. The part of him that had cultivated solitude for a decade screamed at him to say no, to send her on her way and reclaim the quiet emptiness of his life. But the man who had spent a long night tending her fever, the man who had heard her whisper of a world where every touch had a price, could not form the word. He gave a short, jerky nod, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks. "The crossing will be treacherous for a few more days," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. It was an excuse, and they both knew it. "You can work for your keep. I will not have charity in my house." A small, tremulous smile touched Clara's lips, a fragile blossom in the wilderness of her face. "Thank you, Eli." And so, a new season began in the small cabin by the Wind River. It was not a season of the calendar, but of the heart. The river receded, its roar quieting to a companionable murmur. But Clara stayed. She fell into the rhythm of his life, as if she had always been there, filling the spaces he had not even realized were empty. She was a tireless worker. She took over the cooking, and the cabin, which had always smelled of stale coffee and bacon grease, began to carry the scent of fresh bread and simmering stew. He would come in from a long day of riding the fence lines to find a hot meal waiting, a small miracle he had not known he missed. She tended the garden with a fierce devotion, her hands coaxing green life from the stubborn soil. She mended his clothes with neat, almost invisible stitches, her head bent in concentration by the firelight, the silver locket tucked safely beneath her collar. Their companionship was a thing of quiet spaces and shared tasks. Words were sparse, but a language grew between them nonetheless. It was in the way he left a bucket of fresh water for her by the door each morning, and the way she left a hot cup of coffee for him on the hearth. It was in a shared glance across the dinner table, a mutual understanding that needed no voice. For the first time since the war, Eli felt the sharp edges of his solitude begin to soften. Her presence was a low, steady warmth against the persistent chill of his memories. But with this growing comfort came a tension, a fine, high-strung wire pulled taut between them. The cabin was too small for them to exist without touching, a hand brushing his as she took a plate from him, their shoulders bumping as they passed in the narrow space by the stove. Each accidental contact was a spark that lit a fire deep in his gut, a slow-burning heat that both warmed and shamed him. He was a man long unused to the presence of a woman, and his body reacted with a simple, animal hunger that his mind condemned. He was most aware of it in the unguarded moments. One hot afternoon, he came back to the cabin for a drink from the water barrel and saw her down at the creek. She had rolled up her sleeves and was washing her hands and arms, letting the cool water run over her skin. The sunlight filtered through the cottonwoods, dappling her hair and the curve of her neck. Water trickled down her forearms, catching the light like liquid diamonds. It was a simple, innocent act, but watching it, Eli felt a powerful, visceral jolt of desire. It was so sharp, so unexpected, that it felt like a betrayal. He turned away abruptly, his heart hammering against his ribs, ashamed of the thoughts that had risen so easily in his mind. She was a guest, a survivor he had sworn to protect. She was not for him to want. Clara, for her part, began to explore the small cabin as if it were a new world. She was neat and respectful of his things, but her curiosity was a gentle, persistent thing. One rainy afternoon, when the world outside was a gray sheet of water, she found the small wooden chest at the foot of his cot. It was not locked. Inside, beneath his folded army shirt, was a bundle of letters, tied with a fraying piece of twine. They were his letters from the war, the ones he had written home and the few he had received before the silence began. He came inside, soaked from the rain, to find her sitting on the floor, the letters laid carefully in her lap. She was not reading them, just holding the packet, her expression one of sober contemplation. "I am sorry," she said, looking up at him, her eyes wide. "I should not have. I was just tidying." He did not get angry. He simply took off his wet hat and hung it on a peg, his movements slow and weary. "It does not matter." "These are from your brother," she said softly, touching a letter with a different handwriting. "A few of them." She looked down at the faded ink, at the carefully formed letters of a boy trying to sound like a man. "You said he died in a camp." "He did," Eli said, his voice flat. He began to dry his rifle, the methodical task a shield against the memories she was disturbing. "You must feel," she started, then trailed off, unsure of the right word. "I feel nothing about it anymore." He lied. She knew it was a lie. She looked from the letters to his face, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. She was beginning to see the shape of his guilt, the true source of his solitude. It was not just grief. It was the heavy burden of a promise he felt he had broken, the weight of being the one who had survived. She picked up one of his own letters, the paper worn soft at the creases. Would you read one to me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The request was so intimate, so unexpected. It disarmed him. He wanted to refuse, to snatch the letter away and lock it back in the chest. But he looked at her face, at the genuine, compassionate curiosity there, and found he could not. He took the letter she offered, his fingers clumsy. He sat down heavily in the chair opposite her and unfolded the paper. The words he had written as a 20-year-old boy stared back at him. Ghosts from another lifetime. His voice was hoarse as he began to read. "Dearest Mother," he started, the words feeling alien in his mouth. "The marching has been hard. It rains most days, and the mud is a constant enemy. It sucks the boots right off your feet if you are not careful. The food is poor, but we make do." He skipped over the parts about the fighting, the raw, brutal descriptions he had tried to soften for his mother's sake. He read about the boredom, the cold, the longing for a warm bed. Then his voice faltered. "I worry for Samuel. His last letter sounded too bold, too eager for the glory of it all. There is no glory here, Mother, only noise and fear. Tell him to stay. Tell him his brother needs him to stay home and be safe. That is all the glory I require." He stopped, unable to go on, the old, useless plea catching in his throat. He folded the letter, the silence in the cabin profound. Clara did not speak. She simply reached out and laid her hand on his arm, her touch light and warm. It was not a touch of pity, but of understanding, and in that simple gesture, another layer of the wall around his heart crumbled to dust. A week later, the weather had turned fine and hot. Clara had grown more confident, her limp almost gone, a faint touch of color returning to her cheeks. She watched him with his horse, a big steady buckskin named Drum, and he saw a flicker of longing in her eyes.
"I miss it,"
she said one afternoon as he brushed the horse down.
"the feeling of just riding away from everything."
"You can take him, if you like," Eli offered, surprised at his own words. "Just stay on the flat land by the river. He is gentle." Her face lit up with a gratitude so pure it made his chest ache. He helped her mount, his hands spanning her waist for a moment as he lifted her. She was light in his arms, and the contact, brief as it was, sent a jolt through him. He stepped back quickly, his face a stern mask. "Be careful," he ordered gruffly. He watched her ride off, her back straight, her hair coming loose from its braid and flying behind her in the wind. She looked younger, freer than he had ever seen her. He turned back to his work, but a part of his mind followed her, a low-level hum of anxiety he could not shake. An hour later, the hum turned into a roar. He was splitting logs when a sudden, terrified whinny echoed from downriver. It was Drum. Eli dropped the axe and ran, his heart seizing in his chest. He vaulted the fence and sprinted toward the sound, his mind a canvas of terrible images. He found them in a shallow ravine, hidden from the cabin by a line of aspens. Drum stood a few yards away, trembling, his reins tangled in a sagebrush. Clara was half buried in a patch of loose dirt and scree where the edge of the ravine had given way. She was pushing herself up, her face white with shock and smeared with dust. "Clara!" he yelled, his voice raw with a fear that shocked him with its intensity. He slid down the embankment, his boots sending a cascade of pebbles down before him. He reached her in 2 strides, his hands grabbing her shoulders, pulling her fully upright. "Are you hurt? Did you break anything?" he demanded, his hands running over her arms, her back, checking for injury with a frantic urgency. "No, I think I am all right," she stammered, her body shaking violently. "The ground it fell away. Drum shied." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and dark with shock. "I'm so sorry, Eli." He did not hear her apology. All he could feel was the frantic beat of his own heart, the overwhelming, terrifying relief that she was safe. He had not realized, until that moment, how deeply the thought of losing her had taken root in him. Without thinking, without conscious thought at all, he pulled her against him, crushing her to his chest. He buried his face in her dusty, fragrant hair, his arms a cage of iron around her. He held her tightly, as if he could physically impart his own strength into her trembling body, as if he could hold back the world of accidents and dangers that threatened her. She sagged against him, her own arms wrapping around his waist, her face pressed into his shirt. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 survivors clinging to each other in the Wyoming wilderness. He could feel every line of her body, the soft press of her breasts against his ribs, the frantic pulse in her neck against his cheek. Slowly, he loosened his grip, his hands moving to cup her face. He tilted her chin up, his thumbs gently wiping the dust from her cheeks. Her lips were parted, her breath coming in soft, shaky gasps. His gaze dropped to her mouth. The world narrowed to the few inches that separated them. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. He leaned in, his own breath catching in his throat. He was going to kiss her. He wanted to kiss her more than he had wanted anything in a very long time. But then he saw the look in her eyes. Beneath the shock and the burgeoning desire, he saw a flicker of something else, gratitude, and a kind of dutiful surrender. He saw the woman who had offered herself on the first night, the woman who felt she owed him a debt, and he could not do it. He stopped, his lips hovering an inch from hers. The battle inside him was a silent, violent thing. He closed his eyes for a second, then pulled back, the movement sharp and decisive. He let go of her and took a step away, turning to catch Drum's reins, his hands not quite steady. The moment was broken. The wire between them snapped. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer companionable. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of unspoken words and unresolved tension. After their meal, Eli sat staring into the fire, sharpening a knife with meticulous, angry strokes. Clara sat on the cot, watching him, her hands clenched in her lap. Finally, she stood up. She walked to the center of the room, positioning herself directly in his line of sight.
"Look at me, Eli,"
she said, her voice quiet but firm. He stopped his work but did not look up. "What is it, Clara?"
"You saved me,"
she said, her voice gaining strength. "You pulled me from the river. You nursed me through a fever. Today, you came running when you thought I was hurt. You saved me again and again." She took a step closer.
"But you never let me thank you."
He finally looked up, his stormy eyes meeting hers.
"There is nothing to thank me for."
"Is there not?" she challenged. She stood before him, bathed in the warm, flickering firelight. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the buttons of the old army shirt she wore, the one he had given her. One by one, she undid them. "Will you stay this time?" she asked, her voice a low, trembling challenge. She shrugged the shirt from her shoulders, letting it fall to the floor. She stood before him in her thin chemise, her skin glowing in the firelight, her faint scars like silver etchings on her back. It was not an offer of payment this time. It was a plea to be seen, to be met as an equal, to be wanted for who she was, not for what she owed. He stood up, his body taut with a desire so fierce it was a physical pain. He closed the space between them in a single stride. He reached out, his calloused hands coming up to cup her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. He looked down at her, his gaze intense, searching. He saw the hope and the fear and the longing warring in her eyes. He wanted her. Gods, how he wanted her. But the words he had held back for so long finally came.
"I want you, Clara,"
he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "But not because you feel you owe me." A single, perfect tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. Then another. She did not make a sound, but her shoulders began to shake with silent, racking sobs. She wept for the shame she had carried, for the men who had taken without asking, for the kindness she did not know how to accept. She finally broke, her voice a shattered whisper. "When the drought was bad, back in Kansas," she confessed, the words torn from the deepest part of her.
"Before Silas, my parents were gone. There was no food.
She could not say the words, but he understood. She had traded the only thing she had left for a loaf of bread, for a chance to see another sunrise.
"The shame,"
she wept.
"It will not leave me. It is all I have ever felt I was worth."
Eli pulled her gently against his chest, his arms wrapping around her bare shoulders. He held her as she cried, stroking her hair, letting her sorrow wash over them both. When her sobs finally quieted, he tilted her face up to his again. "That does not make you less," he told her, his voice soft but filled with a conviction as solid as the mountains outside. "That makes you braver than most men I have known." The morning broke clear and sharp, the light washing the cabin in pale gold. Eli woke on his bedroll to the scent of coffee and the quiet sounds of Clara moving about the room. The tension of the previous night had broken like a fever, leaving the air clean and still. He had not slept beside her, but had kept his vigil by the fire, giving her the cot and the space her raw confession deserved. He sat up, and her eyes met his across the room. There was no shame in her gaze, no fear, only a quiet, waiting stillness. He stood and walked to her, the wooden floor cool beneath his bare feet. He stopped just before her, the space between them humming with everything that had been said and everything that had not. He raised a hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently touched her cheek. His thumb brushed away the faint, lingering trace of a tear. She did not flinch. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed, a soft sigh escaping her lips. It was an invitation, an acceptance. He lowered his head, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. The kiss, when it came, was not a thing of fire and passion. It was as soft and hesitant as the dawn itself. Her lips were gentle against his, tasting faintly of coffee and sorrow. It was a kiss of profound and aching tenderness, a silent conversation between two scarred souls. It spoke of shared pain and a dawning, fragile hope. It was a promise, not of forever, but of this moment, here, now. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cool morning air. A peace settled over him, so deep and unfamiliar it was almost frightening.
Clara,
he whispered, the name a prayer on his lips. She did not answer with words. She simply took his hand and led him to the cot. She lay down, her worn calico dress a stark contrast to the rough wool of his blanket, and patted the space beside her. He lay down next to her, his body stiff and uncertain. She curled into his side, laying her head upon his chest, right over the steady, heavy beat of his heart. His arm came around her instinctively, pulling her close. She was fully clothed, and he made no move to change that. This was not about desire. It was about sanctuary. Within moments, her breathing deepened into the slow, even rhythm of sleep. For the first time since he had pulled her from the river, Clara Jensen slept a sleep of true and utter peace, safe in the arms of the man who had seen her brokenness and called her brave. The peace was shattered 2 days later. Eli was returning from the high pasture when he saw the familiar figure of Jed, the ranch hand, riding hard toward the cabin. There was an urgency in his posture that set Eli's teeth on edge. Clara was outside, hanging his mended shirts on the line, and she saw him too. A shadow of her old fear crossed her face.
Trouble?
She asked as Eli came to stand beside her. We will see, he said, his hand resting almost unconsciously on the worn grip of the pistol at his hip. Jed pulled his horse to a dusty halt, his young face grim. Walker, ma'am. He nodded at Clara. I came as soon as I heard. I was in town for supplies.
Heard what, Jed?
Eli's voice was low and dangerous. There is a man in Lander, asking about the widow Jensen. Jed glanced nervously at Clara. Says his name is Amos Jensen, Silas's brother. He is telling anyone who will listen that she ran off with a strongbox full of money that was rightfully his. He is stirring up a whole mess of trouble. Clara went white. She swayed on her feet, and Eli's arm shot out to steady her. Amos, she breathed. The name a curse. He is a liar. Maybe so, ma'am, Jed said, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. But he is a convincing one, and the sheriff seems to be listening. Amos is painting a real ugly picture. Says his brother took you in when you had nothing, and you repaid him with thieving and deceit.
That is not true,
Clara whispered, her voice trembling. He aims to press charges, Jed finished, looking at Eli. I thought you ought to know. He is forming a posse of sorts with some of the men Silas owed money to. They are talking about riding out to the homestead first, then checking the remote cabins. Eli's face was a granite mask.
Thank you, Jed. You did right to come.
Watch yourself, Walker, the young man said, then wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving them in a cloud of dust and dread. Clara was trembling, her eyes wide with a terror that was bone deep. He will not stop. Eli, Amos is a cruel man. He hated me. He always told Silas I was beneath them. Let him talk, Eli said, his voice a low growl. We are going to town. We will speak to the sheriff ourselves. The law will sort this out. His confidence felt hollow, but it was the only thing he had to offer. He saddled his horse, Drum, and a quieter mare he kept for packing supplies. The ride to Lander was long and tense. Clara rode close beside him, her face set, her silence a heavy weight between them. Eli watched the horizon, his hand never far from his gun, every shadow a potential threat. Lander was a chaotic collection of clapboard buildings and muddy streets, buzzing with the harsh energy of the frontier. The sheriff's office was a small, dusty building with a single barred window. Inside, a large, bull-necked man with a stained vest and a drooping mustache sat behind a cluttered desk. He looked up as they entered, his eyes lingering on Clara with a look of undisguised appraisal.
"Sheriff Brody," Eli said, his voice even. "My name is Eli Walker. This is Mrs. Clara Jensen. We have come to clear up a misunderstanding."
Sheriff Brody leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. He picked at his teeth with a sliver of wood. "Jensen, you say? I have been hearing that name quite a bit. Your brother-in-law was in here not an hour ago. A fine, upstanding man. Tells me you ran off with his family's inheritance."
"He is lying,"
Clara said, her voice shaking but clear.
"The money was not his. There was no inheritance. My husband left nothing but debts."
"That is not what Amos says," Brody replied, his tone bored. He looked at Eli. "And who are you in all this? Walker? I know you, the quiet man from the river. Seems you have found your voice, and some trouble to go with it." "I found Mrs. Jensen near drowned in the Wind River," Eli stated, his temper fraying. "She was fleeing for her life. This man, Amos, is using the law to persecute her." The sheriff snorted. "Persecute or seek justice? He has got 2 witnesses, men who say they saw you packing a heavy box into your saddlebags the night you fled. Says you were his brother's woman, not his wife, and you took what was not yours." He leaned forward, his gaze hardening. "Now, I look at the situation, and I see a grieving brother trying to settle his family's affairs, and I see a woman of questionable reputation, who runs off in the night and shacks up with the first man she finds." His eyes flicked to Clara, a smirk playing on his lips. "It is not a good look, ma'am." Clara flushed, a wave of red creeping up her neck. "That is not what happened." "We are telling you the truth, Sheriff," Eli said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You would take the word of a greedy liar over an honest woman?" "I take the word that makes the most sense," Brody said, standing up. He was a big man, and he used his size to intimidate. "And right now, his story makes a hell of a lot more sense than yours. My advice to you, Mrs. Jensen, is to turn yourself in. We can hold a trial. If you are as innocent as you claim, you have got nothing to fear." He looked at Eli. "And my advice to you, Walker, is to stay out of it. This woman is trouble. Her sort always is." Eli stood frozen, his hand clenched into a fist at his side. He saw in the sheriff's eyes the same blind, smug certainty he had seen in the eyes of officers who sent men to die for a line on a map. There was no justice here. The law was just another weapon, and it was pointed directly at Clara. He turned without another word and grabbed Clara's arm. "We are leaving." He pulled her out of the office and into the harsh afternoon sun. Her face was ashen, all the fight gone out of her. The hope they had ridden into town with had been snuffed out in the dusty, prejudiced air of the sheriff's office.
"What do we do now?"
she whispered, her voice hollow. "We get out of town," he said, his mind racing. "We cannot go back to the cabin. They will look there first." They retrieved their horses and rode out of Lander. Not back the way they came, but south, toward the empty, rolling plains. As twilight fell, they took refuge in an abandoned homesteader's barn, a collapsed and forgotten relic miles from any main trail. It was little more than a skeleton of a building, but it offered shelter from the wind and a place to hide. Eli built a small, smokeless fire in the corner, the flames pushing back the immense, crushing darkness of the prairie. They ate their remaining biscuits in silence. The weight of their predicament settled over them, heavy and suffocating. The law was against them. A posse was likely looking for them. They were fugitives. Suddenly, Clara began to weep. It was not the quiet, stifled sobbing he had heard before. It was a raw, broken sound, a storm of grief and terror that she had held back for years. She curled into a ball on the hay-strewn floor, her body racked with violent sobs. Eli moved to her side, his heart twisting in his chest. He put a hand on her shoulder, and she flinched, turning a face to him that was ravaged by despair. "He was right," she choked out. "The sheriff. He was right. I am nothing, just a woman of questionable reputation."
"Clara, stop!"
"No!" she cried, her voice rising. "You do not understand. You do not know everything." She sat up, her eyes blazing with a wild, desperate light in the fire's glow. "You think you saved some poor innocent widow, but you do not know what he did to me. What Silas did?" The words began to pour out of her, a torrent of poison she had held inside for too long.
"He did not just gamble,"
she said, her voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper.
"He was a monster when he drank. These scars."
She touched her own back.
"He gave me these for burning the bacon, for speaking to another man at the general store, for nothing at all."
Eli listened, his face carved from stone, a murderous rage building in his chest.
"And the locket,"
she sobbed, pulling it from her dress and clutching it in her fist.
"My baby, our son, Thomas, he would have been 2 years old."
Her voice broke.
"That first winter was so hard. There was never enough food. I was weak. Silas, he got angry one night because I was too tired, too sick. He struck me in the belly. I lost the baby the next day. A brutal winter. He told everyone, but it was not the winter. Eli, it was him."
The confession lay between them, ugly and horrifying. This was the final, darkest secret, the source of the deep, inconsolable grief he had only glimpsed.
"The money,"
she whispered, her voice almost gone.
"There was a little money. Not a strong box, just a small canvas bag. Money I'd saved for years.
$1 here, a few coins there. Skimmed from the housekeeping funds, earned from mending clothes for other women. It was my escape. It was for me and Thomas. Before he was gone. After, it was just for me. It was all I had left in the world. And Amos knew about it. He knew, and he wants it." She finally fell silent. Her story told, she looked at him, her eyes hollow, expecting to see disgust, judgment, pity. Eli did not speak for a long time. He looked at her, at the immense, terrible weight of the life she had survived. He saw her not as a victim, but as a soldier who had fought a long, lonely, brutal war and had somehow, impossibly, survived. He reached out and took her hand, the one that was clenched around the locket. Her fingers were like ice. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say, "It will be all right." The words were meaningless in the face of such pain. Instead, he lifted her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, directly over his heart. He made her feel its steady, powerful beat, a life, beating for her. He leaned in close, his voice a low, fierce whisper in the darkness. "If they want you, Clara," he said, his gaze burning into hers, "they will have to take me too." In his words, she did not hear a promise of rescue. She heard a declaration of allegiance. He was not saving her. He was standing with her. He was choosing her side, against the law, against the world. The tears that came to her eyes now were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a profound, shattering release. She looked at him, and for the first time, she did not just see a protector. She saw a partner, an equal. Slowly, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. This kiss was different from the first. It was not hesitant. It was desperate, raw, and deep with a hunger that was not just of the body, but of the soul. It was a kiss that said, "I see you. I am here." He laid her back gently in the hay, his body covering hers. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting the rest of the world into shadow. He began to unbutton her dress, his movements slow, filled with a reverence that was entirely new to her. He touched her skin not with greed, but with awe. He kissed the faint, silver scars on her back, his lips a balm on the wounds left by another man's cruelty. He was worshipping at the altar of her survival. She trembled beneath him, a storm of sensation and emotion breaking loose inside her. Every touch was a discovery, every kiss a reclamation. This was not a transaction. It was not a payment. It was a communion. He was not taking something from her. He was giving her back to herself. As he moved within her, she clung to him, her body arching to meet his. It was a slow, deep, powerful rhythm, a dance of two broken pieces fitting together to make a fragile, beautiful whole. In the flickering light of the barn, surrounded by darkness and danger, their pain and their desire finally fused, forged in the fire of her confession and his devotion, becoming something else entirely, something that felt impossibly like healing. She looked up into his eyes, into the stormy gray depths that held her own reflection, and a whisper escaped her lips, a truth rising from the very core of her being. "You are the only man," she breathed, her voice filled with a wonder she had never known, "who made me feel alive." The aftermath of their union in the abandoned barn was not one of awkward silence or regret, but of a quiet, profound solidarity. The world outside was still a threat, but the world inside, between the two of them, had been forged into something strong and unbreakable in the crucible of their shared confessions. As dawn painted the dusty air with shades of gray and rose, Eli looked at Clara, truly looked at her, and saw not a collection of wounds, but a warrior. "We do not run anymore," he said, his voice a low, determined rumble in the morning stillness. "We fight." Clara, who had spent a lifetime running, looked at the man beside her, his face grim, his eyes filled with a protective fire she had never known, and for the first time, the thought of standing her ground did not feel like a prelude to defeat. It felt like a homecoming. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady. "The truth is our only weapon," he said. "We just need to find someone willing to listen to it." They did not go back to the sheriff. Instead, Eli sought out the town's less official centers of power. He started at the saloon where Silas Jensen had met his end. The place stank of stale beer and desperation. The barkeep, a weary man named Sully with eyes that had seen too much, was wiping down the bar with a dirty rag. He recognized Eli's quiet intensity and wanted no part of it. "I do not know anything," he grunted before Eli even spoke. Eli placed $2 silver on the sticky bar top. "I am not the law. I just want to know who Silas owed." Sully's eyes flickered to the coins, then back to Eli's unblinking gaze. He sighed, the sound of a man tired of other people's trouble. He owed the kind of men you do not want to owe. Fitch and his boys. They are not bankers. Walker. They break legs for a living. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "And the brother, Amos. He was in here the night after Silas was buried, buying drinks for everyone. Not grieving, if you take my meaning. Celebrating." It was not much, but it was a start. It painted a picture of Amos not as a wronged brother, but as a predator. Next, Eli rode out to the farm that neighbored the Jensen homestead. He found the farmer, a gaunt, nervous man named Peterson, mending a fence. Peterson looked at Eli as if he were a ghost, his eyes darting back toward his small, tidy house. "I saw you there," Eli said, his voice calm, not accusing. "That day with the sheriff." "I do not want trouble," Peterson stammered, twisting a piece of wire in his raw hands. "Trouble is already here," Eli said. "I just want to know what you saw after Mrs. Jensen left." Peterson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He glanced over his shoulder again. "I saw the brother, Amos. He came the next day with a wagon. He loaded it up. Not just farm equipment. A rocking chair, a cradle, a box of quilts, woman's things. He took everything." Would you be willing to tell a judge that? Eli asked. Peterson's face went pale. I cannot, Amos, he said if anyone asked. Silas had sold him the things before he died to settle a debt. He said he would burn my barn if I said otherwise. Eli looked at the man's frightened face, at his small, vulnerable farm, and he understood. He did not press him, but he had what he needed, a second crack in Amos's story. Armed with these two truths, he went to see the one man in town who might be more powerful than the sheriff. Judge Miller was a circuit judge, an old man with a spine of iron and eyes that had seen the worst of men, both in the courtroom and on the battlefield. His office, above the general store, was lined with books and smelled of leather and pipe smoke. He was a veteran of Shiloh, and when Eli introduced himself, the judge's gaze sharpened, recognizing a fellow survivor of the Union's bloody campaigns. He did not see a drifter, he saw a sergeant. Eli laid out the story, simply and without emotion. He spoke of pulling Clara from the river, of the sheriff's bias, of the barkeep's story and the farmer's fear. He did not speak of love or tenderness. He spoke of facts and injustice. Judge Miller listened, his fingers steepled under his chin. He had heard Amos's version from the sheriff, a tidy story of theft and betrayal. But he also knew the character of men like Sheriff Brody, and he knew the character of men who had endured 4 years of war. This woman, the judge said, his voice a dry rustle. You are putting your own name and reputation on the line for her. Sergeant, you are certain of her innocence. I am certain of her courage, Eli replied. And I am certain of Amos Jensen's greed. That is all that matters here. The judge was silent for a long moment. Studying Eli, he saw the conviction in his unyielding gaze, the quiet honor that the war had not managed to burn out of him. The court is not officially in session for another month, he said finally. But given the circumstances and the potential for extra legal action, I will agree to review the case informally. Bring Mrs. Jensen to me tomorrow morning. In the meantime, find a room at the boarding house. Stay out of the saloon, and stay out of Sheriff Brody's way. It was more than they could have hoped for. A chance. They took a small, clean room at the boarding house run by a stern but fair-minded widow. When they walked through the town, Eli felt the stares, the way conversations ceased as they passed. He heard the whispers, sharp as insects. Some called Clara a whore who had landed on her feet. Others looked at her with a kind of morbid pity. It was a gauntlet of judgment. But Eli put his hand on the small of her back, a steady, grounding pressure, and Clara, drawing strength from his presence, walked beside him with her head held high, her gaze fixed forward, refusing to let their poison touch her. The next morning, as they prepared to see the judge, a cry of panic came from down the hall of the boarding house. A young woman, the daughter of the blacksmith, had gone into labor weeks before her time. She was barely 18, and her husband was frantic. The town doctor was miles away, tending to a rancher with a broken leg. The boarding house owner was trying to calm the young husband, her face creased with worry. We need someone who knows what they are doing. Clara stepped forward from their doorway. I can help, she said, her voice quiet but clear. My mother was a midwife. She taught me. The woman looked at Clara, her expression a mixture of desperation and suspicion. But another pain-filled cry from the room decided for her. She nodded, and Clara slipped inside. Eli stood guard at the door, a silent sentinel, turning away the curious. For hours, he heard the sounds from within, the low, encouraging murmur of Clara's voice, the pained cries of the young woman, Mary, the sharp, authoritative commands for hot water and clean cloths. And then, a new sound, the thin, angry wail of a newborn baby. A few moments later, the door opened. Clara stood there, her sleeves rolled up, her face tired but shining with a light he had never seen before. A healthy boy, she announced softly. Mary's husband, his face streaked with tears, could only stammer his thanks. The women of the town, who had gathered in a worried huddle in the hallway, looked at Clara with new eyes. They did not see the scandalous woman from the gossip. They saw a woman of skill and compassion, a woman who had calmly and competently brought a new life into their community. The whispers had not stopped, but their tone had begun to change. They never made it to the judge that morning. As Clara was washing up, a commotion erupted in the street below. Eli looked out the window and his blood ran cold. It was Amos Jensen, and he was not alone. He had two hard-faced men with him, the kind of men who wore their guns with casual menace. They looked like Fitch's boys.
"Clara Jensen!"
Amos bellowed from the street, his voice thick with rage and whiskey.
"You have got nowhere left to run. Come out now, or we are coming in."
Eli turned from the window, his face a grim mask. "Stay here," he ordered Clara, pulling his pistol from its holster and checking the load. "No," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Before he could argue, the heavy tread of boots sounded on the stairs. Eli pushed Clara behind him just as the door to their room crashed open. Amos stood there, his face florid, his eyes burning with a venomous hate. His two hired men fanned out behind him, their hands on their pistols. "There you are," Amos sneered, his eyes fixing on Clara. "Hiding behind another man. You're coming with me. You have got something that belongs to my family." "She is not going anywhere," Eli said, his voice dangerously calm. He stood between them, a solid, immovable wall. His gun was not drawn, but his hand hovered near its hilt.
"Stay out of this, Yankee!"
one of the hired men growled.
"This is my business,"
Amos spat.
"She is my business."
He lunged for Clara. Eli moved with the speed of a striking snake. He shoved Amos back with one hand and drew his pistol with the other, but he had underestimated them. The second hired man was already moving, not with a gun, but with a knife. As Eli turned, the man rushed him, the blade a silver arc in the dim hallway. Eli parried the first thrust, the steel scraping against his gun barrel. He brought the heavy pistol down in a brutal arc, catching the man on the side of the head. The man staggered, but he was tough. He came back, jabbing low. Eli felt a sudden, white-hot fire in his left side. He grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain. As the blade sank into his ribs, he stumbled back, a dark, wet stain already spreading across his shirt. Clara screamed. The world seemed to slow down. She saw Eli stagger, his face contorting in pain. She saw Amos smile, a cruel, triumphant smirk. She saw the other man raising his pistol, and in that moment, something inside her snapped. The fear, the grief, the years of helplessness, they burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, unadulterated rage. The gun Eli had dropped clattered on the floorboards near her feet. Without thinking, without hesitating, she dove for it. It felt heavy and alien in her hand. She raised it with both arms, her hands trembling violently, and pointed it at the man who had stabbed Eli. He was turning toward her, a look of surprise on his face. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the narrow hall. The gun kicked back, bruising her hands. The man grunted, a look of profound shock on his face, and clutched at his shoulder where a dark hole had appeared. He dropped his knife and stumbled back against the wall. Everything froze. Amos and the other man stared, stunned, at the small, trembling woman holding the smoking pistol. In that frozen moment, Clara's eyes were only for Eli. He was leaning against the wall, one hand pressed to his side, his face pale as death. He was sliding slowly toward the floor. She thought he was dying. The man who had saved her, the man who had stood for her, the only man who had ever made her feel alive, was dying in front of her. The gun fell from her numb fingers. A terrible, keening sound tore from her throat, a sound of absolute loss. She scrambled to him, Sliding to her knees in the dust and the chaos, she cradled his head in her lap, her hands coming up to cup his face, her tears falling freely onto his pale cheeks.
Eli, no,
She sobbed, her voice breaking.
don't leave me. Please, I cannot lose you too.
She pressed her forehead to his, her body shaking with the force of her grief.
Please, Eli, stay.
The sound of running feet and shouting from the street broke the spell. Sheriff Brody appeared at the top of the stairs, his gun drawn, his face a mask of confusion. Behind him was Judge Miller, his expression grim and resolute. He had heard the commotion and had come himself. His gaze took in the scene in an instant. The wounded hired man, the terrified Amos, Eli bleeding on the floor, and the distraught woman cradling him. His eyes, the eyes of a man who had judged men his whole life, settled on Amos Jensen. "That is enough," the judge's voice boomed. Cutting through the chaos, he pointed a stern finger at Amos. "Sheriff, arrest this man and what is left of his hired help for assault, intimidation of a witness, and anything else you can think of." Sheriff Brody, for all his bluster, knew the judge's authority was absolute. He holstered his pistol and moved to clap irons on a protesting Amos. But Clara heard none of it. Her world had shrunk to the man in her arms. She held him, whispering his name over and over, her tears a desperate, silent prayer. Men were carefully lifting Eli, carrying him from the hallway, his blood leaving a dark trail on the floorboards. She followed, her hand never leaving his, her heart a cold, hard knot of fear in her chest. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain and healing, a slow, arduous climb back into the light. The doctor, when he finally arrived, declared that the knife had missed anything vital but had gone deep, and that Eli's life had been saved by a fraction of an inch and a stubborn constitution. They remained in the boarding house, their small room becoming a sanctuary and a sick bed. Time was measured not by the sun, but by the changing of bandages, the doling out of laudanum for the pain, and the slow, steady return of color to Eli's face. Clara never left his side. She was a fierce, tireless guardian of his recovery. She learned the landscape of his pain, the way a sharp intake of breath meant the wound was pulling, the way a clenching of his jaw meant a fever was rising. She bathed his face with cool water, spoon-fed him broth when he was too weak to lift his head, and read to him from a worn copy of Shakespeare the judge had lent them, her voice a low, soothing current in the quiet room. In this crucible of vulnerability, the last of their walls crumbled. He was no longer just the strong rescuer, and she was no longer the fragile victim. They were simply a man and a woman, bound by a shared fight and a deepening, unspoken love. In the long, quiet nights, she did not return to a separate bedroll on the floor. She lay beside him on the narrow bed, a warm, living presence against his uninjured side. He would fall into a restless sleep, and she would lie awake, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, her hand resting lightly on his chest, as if to assure herself that his heart was still beating. It was in these dark hours that his own ghosts came for him. The war, which he had kept locked away for so long, broke free in his fevered dreams. He would cry out in his sleep, his body thrashing, his hands reaching for a phantom rifle. He was not in Wyoming anymore. He was back in the mud and the blood, the thunder of cannons roaring in his ears. He would shout names, Samuel, mostly, his voice thick with an old, unhealed agony. The first time it happened, Clara was terrified, but then she saw the raw anguish on his face and knew that this was a wound far deeper than any knife could make. She did not try to wake him. Instead, she leaned close, her lips near his ear, and began to speak. "You are not there, Eli," she would whisper, her voice a lifeline in his sea of memory. "You are here, with me, in Lander. The war is over. You are safe." She would describe the room to him, the pattern of the wallpaper, the way the moonlight fell across the floor, the weight of the quilt. She would talk about the river, about the mountains, about the future. She would repeat his name, a soft, steady mantra, until the tension left his body and he would quiet, his breathing evening out, his hand finding hers in the darkness and clinging to it as if it were the only solid thing in the world. She was calming the ghosts that had haunted his solitude, her voice the first peace he had known in a decade. His physical strength returned slowly. He began to sit up, then to stand, leaning heavily on her for support. One afternoon, he took his first few shuffling steps to the window, his arms slung around her shoulders. They stood there, looking out at the dusty street, at the bustle of a life that had gone on without them. "The judge dismissed all charges against you," Eli said, his voice still weak. "Amos and his men are awaiting trial for assault. They will be gone for a long time." "I know," Clara said softly. The town's attitude toward her had undergone a quiet sea change. The story of the fight, coupled with her role in delivering the blacksmith's son, had turned the tide. She was no longer the scandalous woman. She was the woman who had saved the blacksmith's heir and shot a man to protect her own. In the West, such actions earned a grudging, undeniable respect. Women would nod to her on the street. The blacksmith himself had come to the room, hat in hand, and offered them anything they needed, his gratitude absolute. Eli turned his head, his gaze meeting hers. The afternoon light illuminated the lines of weariness and pain on his face, but his eyes were clear, filled with a raw, unguarded emotion. He looked at the woman who had nursed him, who had fought for him, who had faced down his demons with nothing but the soft power of her voice. He saw his future standing right there beside him, and the thought of a life without her was a cold, empty void. He did not have a ring. He did not have wealth or a fine house to offer. He had nothing but the simple, profound truth of his heart. "I want to wake up beside you every morning," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "If you will have a cowboy with a scarred heart." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, blurring the face of the man she loved. His proposal was like him, simple, direct, and stripped of all pretense. It was an offering of a shared life, with all its imperfections and healed-over wounds. She thought of her own past, of the ghosts that still walked with her, the ghost of a husband's cruelty, the ghost of a lost child, the ghost of a desperate girl in a famine. She was as broken, in her own way, as he was. She nodded, a single, decisive movement, her voice breaking as she answered his offer with her own. "Only if you will have a widow with too many ghosts." He did not need to answer. He simply leaned in and kissed her, a long, deep kiss of acceptance and promise, there in the sunlight of the window, with the whole world watching. They were married a week later, not in a church, but under the sprawling branches of a giant cottonwood tree on the bank of the Wind River, not far from Eli's cabin. It was the very same river that had tried to claim her, the place where their story had begun in violence and terror. Now, it was the site of their new beginning. The water ran clear and calm, its murmur a gentle blessing. Judge Miller officiated, his presence lending a solemn, official grace to the simple ceremony. The blacksmith and his wife stood as their witnesses, holding their new baby. Clara wore a pale blue dress she had sewn herself, the color of a hopeful sky. She had woven wildflowers into her hair, and she looked not like a widow, but like a bride. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, a quiet, profound joy settled over them. Eli took her hand, his touch warm and steady. She looked up at him, her heart so full it felt it might burst, and she whispered the question that had defined her journey. But this time it was not a question of desperation or barter. It was a question of love. "Will you stay now?" Eli answered by pulling her close, his arms wrapping around her in a fierce, protective embrace that needed no words. He was home. They did not stay in the old cabin. Together, with the help of the blacksmith and other townsfolk who had come to respect them, they built a new home. It was a small, sturdy house, set on a rise overlooking the river, with a porch for watching the sunset and a proper kitchen with a large window. They built it with their own hands. Every log they set, every nail they drove, a testament to the life they were forging together. The prejudice of the town did not vanish overnight. There were still those who whispered, who looked at Clara with suspicion and at Eli with a mixture of pity and contempt for tying himself to a woman with a past. But the whispers no longer had the power to break them. They had each other, a fortress of love and shared experience that was impervious to the stones of gossip. Their quiet dignity, their steadfast devotion to one another, slowly but surely won over all but the most hardened hearts. The seasons turned. The harsh Wyoming winter gave way to a green, vibrant spring, and then to the long, golden days of summer. Their life settled into a peaceful, hard-working rhythm. They were a part of the land, their joys simple and profound, the success of their garden, the birth of a calf, the quiet evenings spent reading by the fire. One late summer afternoon, they rode out together along the river, the same path he had run in desperation, the same path she had fled in terror. Now, they rode slowly, their horses side by side. A light, easy laughter passed between them, a sound that had once been a stranger to them both. The sunlight, low and golden, glimmered through the leaves of the cottonwoods, painting the world in hues of peace and contentment. As they rode, Clara's hand slipped from her reins and found his, her fingers intertwined with his. A simple, unconscious gesture of belonging. He looked over at her face, which was no longer haunted by fear, but was instead softened by love and lit by a genuine, radiant smile. And in that moment, he smiled back. It was a rare, true smile that reached his stormy eyes and transformed his weathered face, erasing the last shadows of the war, of the grief, of the solitude. His smile said everything. The pain they had both carried for so long, the heavy burdens of their pasts, had not vanished. The ghosts were still there. The scars remained. But now, the pain rested quietly between them, held in the space of their shared love, no longer a weight to be carried alone. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to our From Wild West channel, and please share your thoughts with us in English.